Okay, so good evening, everyone. I'm Leah Alcor. I'm the lead coordinator for global health at the International and Global Health Office. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you tonight for the second Global Health Learning Network event of this year. Please note that this session will be recorded. I will start with the land acknowledgement. We pay respect to the Algonquin people who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region from all nations across Canada who call Ottawa home. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. To introduce you about the Global Health Learning Network. So the Global Health Learning Network is a platform for knowledge growth and exchange with a goal to build a community of practice in global health that reaches across researchers, practitioners, and learners from all global health domains to include members of the public with an interest in global health. The School of Epidemiology and Public Health, Bruyere Health, the WHO Collaborating Center for Knowledge Translation and Health Technology Assessment and Health Equity, and the International and Global Health Office are collaborating to host the Global Health Learning Network events. This session's learning objectives include to showcase real-world experiences in global health through the lens of learners, to explore how health disparities and global health challenges are addressed in diverse regions of the world, and to foster knowledge exchange and discussion on the future of global health practices and research. We have the pleasure to welcome our speakers for today. Our moderator will be Lina Rahuma, third-year medical student. Our speakers are Aquino Milligan, MPH Plus student at the University of Ottawa, Charles Thixton, PhD candidate in epidemiology, Julian Turk, third-year medical student at UOttawa, and Chiara Brito, third-year medical student at UOttawa. So we'll start with Aquino's presentation on building connections, making the most of my practicum experience in Tanzania, followed by Charles, malaria trials and tribulations, examining how spatial factors impact malaria vector control trials. Then with Julian's presentation on community health in Tanzania, a medical student's perspective. Then we'll end with Chiara, from Canada to Brazil, insights from a surgical elective in Rio. Please make sure to add your questions in the chat. We'll try to answer them after each presentation or at the end of the session, depending on how much time we have. It gives me great pleasure to welcome our moderator for tonight, Lina Rahuma. Lina is a third-year medical student in the French stream at the University of Ottawa. She completed her Bachelor of Applied Sciences in Nutrition and Food Science in 2020 in Toronto. Since arriving at UOttawa, she has been enrolled in the concentration of global health and social accountability and has actively been engaged in many global health initiatives and experiences. She was the VP for global health for the Asclepian Society. She did 2 international placements in Egypt and 1 international research project. Lina, to you now.
Thank you, Leah. So I'll start by introducing our first speaker, Aquino Milligan. Aquino is a second-year MPH Plus student at the University of Ottawa in the Global Health stream with French language training. She completed her Bachelor of Science at the University of Guelph in 2022 when she became interested in global health through a research assistantship focused on international health politics. While at UOttawa, she has expanded on this interest not only through coursework, but a practicum that took her to Tanzania to research climate change and malaria. She is passionate about global health governance, climate change adaptations, and health equity, and hopes to work in these spaces after graduating this spring. The floor is all yours, Aquino.
Thank you for the introduction. I'm sorry I wrote such a wordy bio. So like Lina said, my name is Aquino. I'm a second-year MPH Plus student in the Global Health stream here at the University of Ottawa. And as part of my master's degree, I completed my practicum this summer, working as a research assistant with Insight Research Lab and the Pan-African Malaria Vector Research Consortium, or PAMVERC, in Tanzania. So I wanted to start my presentation with a quick background on the practicum itself. And I know I've already presented this to a lot of people in the audience, so I'm going to keep it brief. Oh. There we go. So basically, like I said, I worked with 2 host organizations for my practicum. So Insight Research Lab at the university conducts epidemiological research about vector-borne diseases, both in Canada and internationally. And then through Insight Lab, I also worked with PAMVIRC, which is a network of research sites across Africa that evaluate insecticides and other control tools for malaria vectors. And specifically, I visited their lab and field sites in Moshi, Tanzania. So my practicum was kind of split into 2 parts. So firstly, I was developing a teaching case study about some of the multi-sectoral and collaborative adaptation measures that are being put into place for climate change and malaria in Tanzania. And then this was used in a graduate level course about climate change and health this semester. And then the other part was that I got to travel to Moshi, Tanzania for 6 weeks to meet and learn from and essentially collaborate with some of the in-country malaria vector control researchers at PAMVIRC. So this is just a photo of one of the field sites at the bottom here. So you might be wondering what insecticide testing for malaria control really entails. And if you're not, that's too bad. I'm going to talk about it anyway, because I think it's interesting. So basically, to give a very quick crash course here, malaria is a vector-borne infectious disease that's very common in many parts of the world, including most of Tanzania, where it's the leading cause of morbidity and mortality. So it's a very big public health issue. And one of the main I just want to talk about this little picture in the bottom left here, which is one of the potential malaria vectors, which is a female Anopheles mosquito. And these can bite people and transmit a parasite called Plasmodium, which can then cause malaria. So when we talk about this public health issue, one of the main interventions that's been put into place is the distribution of special nets that you hang over your bed to basically protect from mosquitoes overnight. And specifically, some of these have been infused with insecticides to make them more effective against mosquitoes. But unfortunately, these have become kind of less effective over time as the mosquitoes become more and more resistant to the insecticide that they've been using for about 10 years. And so the research that I got to take part in here is essentially testing new nets that combine different types of insecticides to see if they're more effective than your typical treated net. And I won't go too much into detail about the actual tests because of confidentiality agreements that I may or may not have signed. But I did find this diagram at the bottom of the slide here, which was publicly available online. And it shows one of the types of tests I got to participate in, which is called a tunnel test. And this is essentially a big plastic tunnel where they put a bait, so a guinea pig, on one side of the tunnel, and then put a piece of treated net that they're going to be assessing in the middle with holes cut into it that mosquitoes can fit through. And then on the right side here, they fill the other side of the tunnel with a set amount of female mosquitoes, close everything up, leave it overnight, and then come back in the morning to see how many of the mosquitoes made it through to be able to feed on the bait and how many survived. And then they can compare different net samples. But with all that being said, I really was not a specialist in mosquito biology or malaria by any means coming into this placement. This is something I got to kind of dive into for the first time in detail because of my practicum. So you might be wondering what I was even doing at PAMVIRC, and luckily I have a list for you here. So a lot of my tasks in the lab involved preparing for, observing, and helping out with these tests, like the tunnel test I just talked about. And I also got to run some mock tests by myself with some of the spare leftover mosquitoes to develop technical skills, which was really fun as well. And then when I went to the field sites, I got to help out with a different type of test that they do out there called a hut trial, which I won't get into. And I also got to assist with mosquito rearing activities. So essentially they breed mosquitoes out there that they can then run these tests on. But really, because I'm not an expert in this, I was coming in to learn as much as possible. And my main role was really to represent Insight Lab and more broadly the University of Ottawa as part of an ongoing sustainable partnership between our institutions. And this is really a high level partnership of which I was one little individual person way at the bottom level here. And because the partnership is so high level, I feel like I was constantly kind of confronted with a dilemma of sorts where I felt like I was very aware I was coming into a lower resource setting. And from my perspective, I was taking and taking and taking, learning so much, gaining new skills, experiencing so many amazing things. And yet on an individual level, I felt a lot of the time like I was not able to contribute or give back in a super meaningful way. And so that leads me to the main question that I want to kind of tackle for the rest of tonight's presentation, which is when we're visiting lower resource communities as global health students with limited experience, what can we even do as individuals to contribute or give back in some kind of way to the institutions and communities that are so kindly hosting us? I'm going to do a brief moment of reflection, and I'm not even going to joke about making everyone turn on their cameras to participate because I don't want you to all run away. So feel free to sit in your room in the dark with the lights off, think, type in the chat, whatever you want. I'm going to stop talking for like 30 seconds and we can reflect on this question together. Okay, I'm back. That might have been really difficult to think about, at least in my experience. It was definitely a difficult question to kind of answer. And I know I was constantly talking about this with the other students I was traveling with and with my supervisor all through my placement. And I think the reason it's so hard to kind of think about this dilemma of sorts is that there's really no right answer, right? It's going to depend on our personal experience, our background, our professional experience, the specific placement that we're embarking on and the community that we're visiting. And even keeping all this in mind, it can be really difficult to try and answer. So in my case, I'm kind of just assigning meaning to experiences I had during the placement after the fact, full transparency. I do want to put this out there before we move on that there is a hopefully obviously wrong answer, and that's to develop essentially like a savior complex and try to take on tasks that we are not qualified to be doing in our day-to-day. So that's obviously unethical and outside of our limits, especially as students. So I just want to put that out there before we move on. But again, there's really no right answer here. So the way that I've decided to kind of tackle this question is through building meaningful connections and engaging in two-way cultural exchange on my placement. And the reason I feel like this allowed me to contribute in some way is that it's kind of a way to, on a much smaller scale, create shared experiences where I felt like either both or all parties involved were able to come away having learned something new or gained new insights or shared and enjoyed an experience together. So if you'll indulge me, I'm going to share some of my favorite examples of interesting conversations and connections I was able to have, starting with professional settings. So the first example I have here is that I got to meet a recent graduate of an MPH program in Tanzania. So we got to compare not only what our MPH programs are like between Tanzania and Canada, but also she had been researching vector-borne diseases in Tanzania and was really interested in hearing about what disease burdens are like in Canada. So we got to have a really interesting, like academic level conversation where we could learn from each other about what the major public health challenges are in each other's countries. My next example here is a lab technician that I met who was very interested in research methods. So for a bit of extra context, some of the research at Pamberg essentially tries to emulate like community conditions in terms of how the nets are used to make it more generalizable to maybe like a low-income rural community. And this technician had lived experience having grown up in one of these communities themselves. And so they were sharing a bit about what that was like, which was very impactful and interesting to hear about for me. But because they were interested in research methods, we also got to have an interesting kind of two-way exchange of ideas in terms of the importance of external validity in research and how to try and kind of maximize that. And then my last 2 points here are kind of all together. When I was at the field site, we had quite a bit of downtime between experiments and tasks. So I got to spend a lot of time chatting with the different students and researchers there and sharing differences and similarities between our cultures and our social determinants of health between Tanzania and Canada. And for me, what I found really interesting was discussions that we got to have kind of about Indigenous issues and specifically the integration of traditional knowledge within healthcare. Because our countries have had very different histories and experiences of colonization. And so that was really interesting to hear from some of these like Indigenous people in Tanzania about what integration of traditional health looks like there versus what it's like in Canada. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about connections that I got to build in personal context, because the gist is essentially I made friends and we did fun things together. But for a bit of context on these photos, on the left here, this is me and the 6 medical students I was traveling with, one of whom you will hear from shortly, along with the other MPH student I was traveling with. And this person in the very back here is a friend that I made in the lab, one of the students there, and we had her over. She taught us how to make some of our favorite Tanzanian foods, so that was a lovely shared experience. And then on the right here, I can't take credit for these connections, but the medical students made some great connections with some Tanzanian medical students who will be coming to Canada in the future. And we had them over for dinner, cooked for them, and they brought us this cake that's in the photos. So that was another lovely shared experience there. So to conclude, basically my point here is that when we are embarking on global health experiences outside of the actual global health work, I think that building connections is really a great way to engage in two-way cultural exchange and really make the most of the experience and also contribute in some way on an individual level. And I definitely recommend to be always reflecting on your place as a student and your role as an individual within a global health partnership when you're on this kind of placement in the future. I just want to thank Dr. Manisha Kulkarni, Insight Lab, Pamberg for a great experience, and thank you to everyone for listening to me tonight.
Thank you, Aquino, for that lovely presentation, sharing your experiences, and also allowing us to reflect a little bit about the experiences we've had in global health settings. So thank you so much for giving us that opportunity. Our next, I don't see any questions in the chat, so if you guys have any questions, feel free to write them in, and we can take the questions at the end. And our next speaker for tonight is Charles. Charles is a PhD candidate in epidemiology at the University of Ottawa and holds a Master's of Science in Epidemiology also from the University of Ottawa. He will share his research on geospatial factors associated with malaria vector control trials and their implications for future trial designs. The floor is all yours, Charles.
Yeah, thanks so much for that intro, and Aquino, thanks so much for setting up, I think, quite a bit of my talk already. So I'm going to be able to hop through the beginning here a little bit quicker than I was expecting. So I'm just going to briefly talk this evening about some work that I've done in Tanzania on a malaria trial, also with the Pan-African Malaria Vector Research Consortium. Which is a trial that was based in Misungwi, Tanzania, targeting some of the new nets that we were previously discussing about in the lab. So if I can get this to move forward, there we go. So just as a very brief primer, malaria is an acute febrile disease caused by Plasmodium species parasites. It's vector-borne, predominantly Anopheles species mosquitoes. It's responsible for about 250 million cases and 600,000 deaths annually. And unfortunately, because of some of the factors that we were talking about earlier, this is a fairly stable number at this point. It was going down for quite a long time. And sort of around 2015, it started to taper off into this sort of stable trend. And it's almost gone back up a couple times over the past few years. So there's been this sort of redoubled effort to sort of push these cases and deaths back down and continue on our hopeful path towards elimination. So our primary tool in the toolkit, as we were mentioning, are insecticide-treated nets. And in the past 20 years, we've delivered about 2.5 billion bed nets, predominantly to sub-Saharan Africa, in this effort. And it's done this enormously beneficial effort to protect against malaria, which is predominantly spread at night. A mosquito will come into your room at night and bite you while you're sleeping, and then rest on the wall before going out and transmitting to someone else at a later point. And the bed net creates both a physical barrier to that intervention, but also if the mosquito touches the bed net, even if it can get through a hole or something to that nature, it's still then likely to succumb to the insecticide, hopefully at a later date. Unfortunately, we're starting to see more and more insecticide-resistant mosquitoes around the world. And so our first-line insecticides, our permethrins, need to be coupled with either synergists or alternate insecticide formulations in order to continue working. And new insecticides means new nets means new interventions, and new interventions means new trials. So the Vector Control Advisory Group has a guidance book on how to design vector control efficacy trials. So when you're testing these bed nets or other types of malaria control interventions, they have this sort of guidebook on how to go about designing those trials. And one of the things that they talk about in the guidebook that I focus on heavily in my research is the spatial aspects of these nets. So when you deliver a bed net to a community, a single net will have a certain protective effect, largely protecting the person that sleeps under it. But the more bed nets that you deliver to an area, the more effective it becomes in that region. As the mosquito populations start to lose access to human hosts to feed off of, and they die off, you create this sort of community herd effect. And so in order to sort of simulate that effect in a trial setting, we don't just deliver bed nets randomly to individuals or even to households, we deliver them randomly to communities. So you'll have two communities that are kind of side by side like this. And then in order to make sure that they're not interfering with each other, that spatial community effect doesn't spill over and cause an effect in the other community that would then contaminate your ability to detect difference between your interventions, they recommend that you put in a form of buffer zone, something that either we have households that we're not sampling from or that we're keeping a certain distance with some kind of natural barrier between these communities in order to prevent this contamination. And you can do this with a buffer zone or what they call a fried egg design, where you have a sort of a circular buffer encompassing a whole community, and you only sample from the center area. This is a fried egg design for obvious reasons. So in designing a trial like this, the first thing, if you want to build out these community-based spatial distance separations, you have to go out and find all the households. So the first thing that we did in this trial is got a bunch of people together with GPS units and data recorders and went out into the field to try and find all of the households. So I was lucky enough to be able to accompany a team on a couple days of this process before allocating households. So this here on the left is my local partner, Tatu Azizi, and the man on the left is a hamlet leader from the area. So we'll contact the hamlet leaders ahead of time. They know where all the households in their hamlet are, and they'll literally just walk us out into the field till we find the house. We take a GPS read, we gather some basic demographic information, like how many people live here and how old are they. So in a very real sense, a census. And once we've done that 42,000 times, we get a map that looks something like this. So this is our data map of all of the censused households in the Masangui trial area. So yeah, over 42,000 households, various different factors and numbers of people living in them with data points on each of these. And my first job on this trial was to go in here and carve out as many individual communities as possible that all had a certain distance separation so that we could protect from malaria. So in our trial, we chose 600 meters as our buffer area, although my research is focused largely on how large that buffer size should be. That's not really what I'm going to talk about today, but I'm happy to have conversations about that if you're interested in that part of this. But largely, I was able to pull together this map of 86 different cluster areas. And the gray areas in between are the buffer areas where we're protecting each from each other in terms of our interventions. If I zoom in a little bit, it looks a bit like this. So little dots are households. We have our gray buffer areas, and the dark lines are our cluster boundaries. And you can see that I've drawn some lines here so that each household that's in a core sampling area is at least 600 meters away from a household in any other cluster. And so that's just ensuring that there's a spatial separation in these areas, that they're not contaminating each other. So when you look at a map like this, it looks very tidy. It looks very much like we think of administrative areas in the West. But something that I was really cognizant of when I was building this map out is that that's not what I was looking at when I was looking at these households on the ground. If you take a little bit of a close look on this map on the right, you can see that there's a whole bunch of patterns here that we don't have any context to identify or to work through. So there's this large mass of houses in sort of the center upper section of the area. And then there's a bunch of gaps in places. Some of the gaps were because we didn't gather household data there, but some of the gaps are just kind of in the middle of everything in a strange way, almost like there should be a hamlet there that there isn't. And so one of the things that I did was I really wanted to understand what I was looking at. So I went and collected some extra data. So this is what's called a digital elevation model. This is from the Japan Space Agency. They have a thing called ALOS 3D Worlds. This is a 30-meter resolution data map of elevation in the area. And the blue area in the top left is the Bay of Mwanza, which is an inlet from Lake Victoria. And then the green to red color spectrum here is sort of increasing elevation. And every pixel in this map is a 30 by 30 meter square of how much of what the elevation above sea level is at that point. And already I can start to see some really, really interesting patterns here that we can then get into about how these communities are organizing themselves and what barriers that may be preventing or causing other factors in our malaria trial. And one of the things I love about digital elevation models is you can do some really cool things with them, one of which is you can sort of figure out where rivers should be. So this is a map that I derived using a flow model in ArcGIS, which basically is just, if we drop water on every point of this map, water is always going to flow downhill. And if we just take all of the other factors like the ground absorbing water or anything of that nature out of the picture for a second, and we just say, if we drop even water everywhere and it all flows downhill, this is where you're going to find rivers. And you can see in those little sort of valleys that there's some river pathways moving through the study map. And rivers are really important for malaria because where there's water, there's mosquitoes. And I also wanted to grab some other context. So this is a road map, and I've overlaid our households on the study area. So you can really start to see, like, the more data that I add to this map, the more context I have in the study area, and the more we can start to understand some of these patterns that we're seeing. And I'm cognizant of time, so I'm going to move along pretty quickly here. So I'm just going to zoom in really quickly on this one section of the map here. And this map where we have some sort of rivers coming down these river valleys with households on the sides as they come up into the sort of mountainous regions in the map. Really caught my eye because it both explained these sort of protruding areas, but also raised more questions to me, right? Like, why is no one living on the coast of the lake, which presumably I would think would have large economic opportunities? And how do these rivers impact daily life or travel or things like that? So my supervisor asked the question that is always fun to hear, which is, how much do you trust this model? And there we go. So we developed out this hydrological model and decided to go take a look. And so we did these hike throughs and drone mapping in the study area to try and identify where these rivers actually were and how water sources in the area might be used or impact the malaria in our trial setting. And so our water source mapping project started growing rapidly. So this is a project partner. So this is Tatu, again, on the right from earlier. And then a young woman from my lab, Claudia the Guy, who just graduated from the PhD program this year, going into Tanzania. And we actually did these community walkthroughs where we were going all over the landscape and just identifying water source areas, GPS coding them, and then doing drone imagery to try and find how these might impact our malaria trial downstream. So this is one of my rivers. Doesn't look super, super interesting on surface value. But we were there during dry season, and you can really see how these river pathways sort of carve through the landscape during the rainy seasons and when they come up. And I'm gonna, I think, cut things relatively short there because I'm out of time. But something I did want to just really quickly talk about is I did start noticing this pattern on trees in the area. And this tree in particular clued me in because there's a lot of little shells around it. And we weren't near the lake here at all. And my very, very professional measuring stick here of my water bottle, that's like a foot high, but there's no bark on the bottom of the tree. And when talking to our the community members in the area, we found out that this is a floodplain during the rainy season that sort of settles into these river valleys. And so this, from all the way along the mountains on the left there and all the way along the mountains on the right, is just a flat of water during rain. So in terms of how the water impacts our malaria trial, there's a whole 2 months of the year when there's just water everywhere. So just to keep in mind that sometimes the context you're seeing on a map or when you're in Ottawa and the context on the ground can vary wildly, even depending on like when you're in an area and looking through things. So I'll wrap it up there. I have a bit more, but I'm happy to talk about it later, but I don't want to overrun my time by too much. So thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Charles, for sharing your research and all the steps it took to carry out some of the parts of your research. It's very interesting how we don't actually know a lot of the behind the scenes that happens when it comes to research. And I guess walking through those river pathways led you to learn a lot more about the malaria season. So very interesting overall. Thank you for sharing that. And I don't see any questions, so I think we'll move on to Julian. So Julian is our next speaker for tonight. Julian is a third-year medical student at the University of Ottawa in the French stream and is also enrolled in the concentration in global health and social accountability. He completed his Bachelor of Science at McGill University in 2022. Since arriving at UOttawa, he has been an active member of the concentration, serving as a student ambassador, participating in various workshops and summer completing clinical electives in rural Ontario, Yukon, Tanzania, and Oman. In the future, he hopes to train as an emergency medicine physician and contribute to global health projects in Northern Canada and abroad. The floor is all yours, Julian.
Thanks so much, Lena. Thanks everybody for being here tonight. As Lena mentioned, my name is Joignez-vous. I'm a third-year medical student enrolled in the French stream here at UOttawa. Bien sûr, je parle aussi français, fait que s'il y a des questions en français, ça va me faire plaisir de les répondre en français. Today our presentation will be in English though, so today I'm going to be talking a little bit more about my elective that I did in Tanzania this summer. And before I begin, I want to give a quick plug for the concentration in global health for all our med students in the audience tonight. It's a really good opportunity to get involved in global health throughout your medical studies. Myself and Lena are ambassadors this year, and so we're more than happy to answer any questions that you may have throughout. But without further ado, let's jump right in. So this summer I had the opportunity to participate in a community health elective in Tanzania. So this was a 4-week elective in Moshi, Tanzania. Again, utilizing the same partnership that Aquino utilized for her practicum between Kilimanjaro Christian Medical University College and the Kilimanjaro Christian Medical Center Hospital in Moshi. So this was a community-based elective, so it was non-clinical. And so the point of this elective wasn't, to get our ACLS or to learn how to give IM injections or get better at auscultating hearts. It was really to see how community health is delivered in a low resource setting. So the way that we did that is we worked with 2 organizations in Moshi. We worked with the Majengo Health Center, which is a maternal and newborn health center in the center of Moshi in a very urban area. And then we also worked with Kiwakuki, which is a grassroots AIDS organization that I'll talk a little bit more about in a bit. And as Aquino mentioned, this was a bilateral exchange. So we had 6 medical students from the University of Ottawa that made the trip down to Tanzania, and we'll be welcoming some students from Tanzania up here in Ottawa in a couple months' time, which we're really looking forward to. So let's go over a couple of my objectives for this elective. So as I mentioned, being involved in the global health concentration, global health has been something that's been on my mind for a long time. And as a learner, it's something that's difficult to engage with in an ethical way. And so for me, this was really kind of a best case scenario for engaging in an ethical global health partnership because of this bilateral agreement that we had. So as a learner, as Aquino mentioned very well in her presentation, we can't really offer much when we're down there because we don't really have any expertise yet, right? We're gaining that expertise through our training. And so when there's a bilateral exchange where we can offer sort of an experience for learners to come to Canada and see a little bit more about how we practice healthcare in our country, it's a way to kind of ensure that things are a little bit more ethical and a little bit more bilateral. Obviously, this being a community health elective, I wanted to see firsthand how community health is delivered in low resource settings. Having worked a little bit in rural Canada and in northern Canada as well, I understand that even in Canada, we have low resource settings in these rural communities. And so for me, there was a lot that I think could be learned from our partners down in the global south that we could potentially, implement here in Canada, or just kind of see how things are done differently in other places. And then, of course, I wanted to learn from locals, engage in knowledge sharing in a culturally sensitive way. And cultural sensitivity is, a broad term that means different things to different people. But for me, it meant doing it in a way that was respectful, and making sure that I had good base knowledge and cultural norms and traditions in the place before I showed up, and that I kept an open mind and engaging with it while I was there. And then, of course, lastly, I wanted to make, lasting connections with locals. The bilateralness of our exchange, really allows for that. We'll be able to see our friends again in April. And it was just such a unique opportunity to be able to learn from local leaders and local practitioners in Tanzania. So where were we exactly? So just a quick geography lesson for everybody. So Tanzania, located in the African continent, right below Kenya and above Mozambique. And we were staying in Moshi, which is in the northeast corner, right on the border with Kenya and sort of in the shadows of Mount Kilimanjaro. So this is KCMU. These are the college grounds over here where the med students and the allied health train. And then over here is a photo of the Kilimanjaro Christian Medical Center, which we actually didn't spend too much time in, but was nice to see sort of attached to the med school, and we got to visit it a couple times. This is where we lived. So we were on the doctor's compound. As I mentioned, there were 6 med students, 2 MPH students. We had beautiful accommodations, everything we needed. We were really well set up here. This is, again, the same photo. So you guys already know the background of that with our friend Glory enjoying some traditional Tanzanian dishes. This is our elective calendar. So for the med students in the audience that are, looking to kind of participate, this is what your elective will look like. So they expanded it for our year, and we actually had more students than the year before. So our first week was sort of an introductory week. We kind of got our bearings, got to meet some of the local leaders in the community and get oriented with the school and with the hospital and with our different community organizations. And then we were split into 2 cohorts. So the first cohort did 1 week at Majengo, and then the next week you were at Kiwakuki. And then our last week was sort of a wrap-up week where we got to spend 1 full day actually on the wards in the hospital. We got to choose what specialty we wanted to shadow in. And so because I had an interest in emergency medicine, I decided to spend a day in the ED. And we saw everything from heli evacs off of Kilimanjaro to your run-of-the-mill COPD exacerbation patients to local traumas and that kind of thing being sent to the hospital. So yeah, that's a little bit about our schedule. And again, happy to share this with any prospective students that are looking to get involved. So Majengo Community Health Center, this is where I started my first week. And so as I mentioned, it's a maternal health center based in the community, and they also offer neonatal care and prenatal care. So over here, you have a photo of the labor ward. And so at the Majengo Health Center, they did mostly uncomplicated vaginal births. You'll notice that there was no anesthesia machine, no IV setup. It's because there was no analgesias that were offered to the patients there. Everything was au naturel. And basically it was very community organized. Women would come in, often accompanied by sisters, friends, aunties, their partners. They would spend some time in the maternity ward before they were starting their labor. And then once they were ready, they would come into the labor ward here and they would deliver their babies. So it was a really unique opportunity to see how it's done in the community. It's not something that we're exposed to very often as med students here in Canada. Most of our training is done in big tertiary centers. So to see how maternal health can be delivered in the community setting was very, very eye-opening, especially in a low resource one. The middle photo is our kind of main area of the clinic where we would see our newborn babies. And so we have a scale there where we'd weigh our babies. We would give them the appropriate supplements, some antiparasitics as well, and then we would document all their weights in their own booklets as well. And then over the last photo is our prenatal clinic where we would see all of our pregnant patients. We would do fundoscopic height. We would find the fetal heartbeat, but not with Dopplers. We would use a little cone thing you can see here. It's a little blue thing in the middle of the table. We would, of course, give the proper supplements, give vaccines if needed, take weights of the mothers, blood pressure, try to monitor their health. And that's basically all of the roles that were done there. So it was really interesting to see sort of how again, how healthcare was delivered in this low resource setting and how they took care of their patients. Next, we have Kiwakuki, which was a lot less clinical of an environment. So this, like I mentioned, it's a grassroots AIDS organization. And so they really focused, primarily when they started, they focused on testing and education. And as the AIDS epidemic has evolved and sort of, the prevalence has decreased in Tanzania and around the world, thankfully, they've shifted their work to more of an empowerment focus. So they would work on empowering those that are HIV positive in the community to participate in agricultural circles that they would set up. And so they would help allocate plots of land where citizens could go and grow primarily banana crops, different types of banana crops. So it's really interesting to learn about the different technologies and things that they would use to kind of grow their bananas. And then they also would do some microfinancing as well. So people that were involved in the agriculture could take out emergency loans if they needed it to pay for medical bills or pay for school and that kind of thing. So it was really interesting to see, again, a grassroots organization delivering community health in a low resource setting. Yeah, really great experience working with Kiwakuki. As I mentioned, the testing and education part is still prominent, but because HIV testing has shifted to more of a public health and sort of being delivered by public health institutions like hospitals and health centers like the Majengo Health Center, they did a lot less testing nowadays. But again, still very interesting to participate and work alongside our colleagues down there. So, quick reflection. I think that Aquino really hit the nail on the head with this part in her presentation, so I won't spend too much time on it, but I think, again, it's really important to do this reflection when we're finished our practicums and when we've participated in these electives. I think when I think back overall, going to Tanzania was an amazing experience, and I'd recommend it to everybody. Seeing low resource community health being implemented was really eye-opening. It shows sort of the creativity, the adaptability, and the resilience of Tanzanians. And there was a lot to take away for myself, for sure. And I think that cultural sensitivity and the ethics of global health trips as a learner are very complicated, as we mentioned already. It's important to think about your place there and that you're offering a listening ear and you're acting as a sponge as a student, but you're not really offering much of anything in terms of healthcare and in terms of actionable, like deliverable things while you're there. So it's important to just think about that and to consider that while you're there and to try to be as culturally sensitive as possible. There's different ways to do that. And I think it's really important to reflect on that before you embark on a global health elective. So my final advice is just think about your why. Think about, why do I want to go on this global health trip? What are my goals and how am I going to make sure that I'm doing it in a culturally sensitive way and an ethical way? So that's the bulk of the main part of my presentation. I want to share a little bit more about, the joys of being able to participate in these kind of things. And that's, of course, experiencing the culture, seeing the country, meeting the people. And so we definitely got the chance to do that. Over here is a photo of us on a safari one weekend on our downtime, which was great. At the end of our practicum, a couple of us, the med students, decided to climb Kili, which was super fun, very draining, but a really great experience overall. Again, another awesome opportunity to interact with the locals and climb the mountain. And then at the end of our time on the mountain, we cooled off on the island of Zanzibar, which was really awesome as well, of course. So that's pretty much all I had for tonight. Again, for the med students in the crowd, I'm happy to answer any questions, and I really, really encourage you to apply to the elective this year. It's definitely been one of the best things I've done so far in medical school, and I hope to continue engaging in global health stuff in the future. As I mentioned earlier on, I've participated in other aspects of the concentration too, including the IFMSA exchange that Kiara is going to talk to us a little bit more about later. I had the chance to go to Oman in the Middle East this summer, which was also really awesome and more of a clinical elective. So if that's more your cup of tea, then that might be a better avenue. And then as well, workshops and courses and that kind of stuff. There's really a lot of great opportunities through IGO. So I encourage you to participate. Thanks a lot, everyone. And I'll pass it back over to Lena.
Thank you, Julian, and thank you for emphasizing the importance of the ethical participation in global health and the advantage of the bilateral exchange and also the diversity of your experience in Tanzania. It seems like it was a really great experience. And I think we can wait if there's any questions. Don't see any right now. Again, guys, feel free to type your questions in the chat and we can answer them anything comes in now for Julian, and if not, at the end for everyone. Our next speaker for tonight is Kiara. Kiara is a third-year medical student at the University of Ottawa, studying in the French stream and registered in the concentration in global health and social accountability. She completed an honors and bachelor's of science in biomedical science at the University of Ottawa in 2022. Having grown up across 4 countries, England, Belgium, Panama, and Italy, Kiara has long aspired to blend her passion for travel and her dedication to medicine. Recently, she completed a 4-week international elective in surgery in Brazil, which deepened her commitment to addressing health disparities both locally and globally. She hopes to specialize in pediatric medicine and practice both in Canada and internationally. The floor is all yours, Kiara.
Thank you, Lena. So yes, my name is Kiara. I'm in the French stream. So just like Julian, if you do have a question in French, I can answer in French as well at the end. But I went to Teresópolis in Rio this summer for 4 weeks in July. So that's kind of what I'm going to talk about. I wanted to talk about my experience, talk about what I learned and how it relates to global health as well. And the challenges that I found. And then, of course, I have some pictures at the end of my travel because I did get to travel in Brazil. So I was in Teresópolis, which is a town or a city 2 hours away from Rio, Rio de Janeiro, but it's in the province of Rio. So the population was about 165,000 people. And you can see on the picture there that it's on the eastern side. So that's right where Rio de Janeiro is. And it's known for its nice views and for the hikes. So I didn't do Kilimanjaro, but I did do a very nice hike at the end of my time in Brazil. So just like Lena said in my intro, I did grow up a little bit everywhere. And it allowed me to get exposed to a lot of different cultures and a lot of different languages too. And to get kind of the itch for travel, but the itch for learning about different cultures and getting exposed. So that's why I wanted to go to Brazil for this exchange. And I did it through the IFMSA, the International Federation of Med Students, and CFMS, the Canadian Federation of Med Student Association. And it was this application, we applied in September, we answered a couple questions, and then we didn't hear back till end of November, December. And then you apply for, you rank a couple countries, and then you also rank some specialties, and you get what you get. So I got Brazil in surgery. So I was there for 4 weeks in Teresópolis. Throughout this program, I was able to, let me go back, get a lot of exposure. And I learned about the Brazilian healthcare system, which is the unified health system, the SUS. And it's the public system. They do have a private system for those wealthier Brazilians that could afford it. But for the most part, it's the public system, which is also where med students are placed. So I was in that system, and I got to see firsthand sort of some of the difficulties of lack of resources, which, just like Julian mentioned, it's present and prevalent in Canada as well, in rural communities mostly. But in Brazil, that was the case. So as you can see, most of the population is located on the eastern side of the country. And they also had lack of resources in the public system. So that's something that I noticed quite a bit, was medicine was very different in Brazil than it is at the Ottawa Hospital or at the Montfort Hospital, which is where the French stream does their rotations. And for me, it made medicine that much more impressive and interesting. The fact that physicians could do surgery and do everything that they had to do with limited resources. And I noticed a lot of very good teamwork within the team. And it taught me how to become a better physician. So I did have a clinical placement, unlike some of the other placements. So I'll talk about what I did, pretty much just surgery. So I would walk into a surgery, I would scrub in, or I would observe, depending on what the surgery was. So I was kind of in a lot of different ones. I did ortho surgeries, I did OB, neurosurge, pediatrics, urology, and they allowed me to do a lot. So I got great exposure, clinical exposure, mostly stitches. They allowed me to close laparoscopic surgeries, which was great exposure. I got to do some intubations, which we get to do in our third year in anesthesia. They let me do some spinals as well. And I learned how to scrub in, though I think I'll have to relearn that for Canadian standards, because I do think it was very different in terms of sterility. And I don't know if you can see, but in the picture in the middle, there's a man behind, or he's the anesthesiologist walking around, but his mask is not on his face. So that just goes to show that would not fly in a Canadian OR. You definitely need to be wearing your mask at all times. So it's very different. I adapted to different situations. And it's very interesting to learn about that over there. The number one surgery that I saw was traumatic orthopedic surgeries, because a lot of Brazilians ride on motorbikes. In fact, you can get a moto Uber if you want, and it causes a lot of accidents, and they don't often wear helmets. So that was the big one. And the most interesting surgery I saw was post-traumatic and post-accident on a motorbike. And it was a maxillofacial surgery where they had to reconstruct a patient's face. So that was a very, very impressive surgery and great exposure that I don't expect to get necessarily during my rotations in third year here. And the first surgery I ever scrubbed in on in Brazil was this vertebroplasty. So the neurosurgeon asked to take a picture with me. And so you see him there doing a peace sign. But a vertebroplasty is a minimally invasive procedure in which you inject cement into the vertebrae that's been fractured. So he let me inject that, and then he let me inject some in my hand and play around with the cement while we waited for it to harden. So that was my very first surgery. In the hospital, they fed me every single day. So I got exposed to Brazilian food, which was delicious. A lot of rice and beans. I will say I had to adapt to that at first. But it was very delicious food, and it really showed me kind of the real life in Brazil, because all of the staff gets a free lunch every day. So we kind of got immersed in the hospital life over there. And this was the team. So this it includes nurses, surgeons, residents, and then other med students as well. So there were other international students that were in Teresópolis at the same time as me, including on the right here, on the left-hand side of that right picture is Marta, a Polish student. So she was doing the same placement as me. And in the middle, it was our favorite scrub nurse, who's very, very helpful in all things. Because one of the major difficulties that I had was nobody spoke English. So that was very difficult, especially at first. And I was told people would speak English, but I did make an effort to try to practice my Duolingo and try to learn as much Portuguese as I could before I showed up. But it was definitely a bit of a shock when everyone only spoke Portuguese to me, and I understood about maybe half of what they were saying. By the end, I think I understood quite a bit more, and I was able to communicate in what they call Portuñol, which is a mix of Portuguese and Spanish, Espanol, because I do speak Spanish and I speak Italian and French, which was very, very helpful, but it's still not Portuguese. So I definitely butchered their language a little bit, but they were very understanding, and I did my very best to communicate in their language. And that's, I think, an important point that was brought up by Aquino and Julian as well, is it's super important to be culturally sensitive when you go to different places. And part of that for me was the language. So it's important for me to try and to make an effort to communicate in Portuñol, more so than in English, because they were more likely to understand my butchered Portuguese than my English. And my Spanish was also much closer to Portuguese than English is. So I think, you know, English is the universal language, but it's important to try and to make an effort because they did not speak English. So that was important to me there. And I relied on the scrub nurse a lot because she knew everything about every single surgery. So instead of asking the surgeon, I would ask her. And I think that's important, to be open to feedback, but open to asking questions and asking for help. These are just the other students that were there at the same time as me. So the girl on the top left was our Brazilian med student host. So she hosted all of us in her house. And there's 2 Portuguese girls, 1 Tunisian and 1 Polish. And it was great to learn about Brazil and experience this with these other international students, but it was also really nice to learn about their countries. So we had an international food night where we all made food from our countries. I made Nanaimo bars as the dessert. I was really proud of that. It was really good. But I got to experience a bit learn about their countries as well, which was a big plus of this exchange. And finally, I spent some time outside of the hospital too. Though the surgery hours were really long, I got to travel. So I traveled a lot in Rio because it's a very iconic city and it was only 2 hours away from where I was. So the 2 pictures, the one on the right and the one in the middle, are of Rio de Janeiro. And then on the left is Ilha Grande, which is an island a few hours off of the coast. And it was paradise on earth. So it's a gorgeous island. And then this is Rio. So of course, Christ the Redeemer, and a picture from the top of Sugarloaf Mountain on the right. Incredible views. And the 2 girls that are in these pictures are uOttawa med students. You might recognize them. So there's Gianna and Erica. Gianna's in the English stream and Erica's in the French stream with me. And they both did an exchange in Brazil as well through the same IFMSA in different cities, or well, in different provinces in Brazil, sorry. So after our 4 weeks, we got to travel together and that was great. We spent a week traveling and we even, we saw all these places in Rio. I got to go to a soccer game in the Maracanã Stadium, which was incredible, a very exhilarating experience. And then that's the view from the top of Sugarloaf Mountain. And then we also got to go to Iguaçu Falls, which is one of the 7 natural wonders of the world. And those views were incredible. Often people ask how it compares to Niagara Falls. And you'll only know once you go to the Iguaçu Falls that you can't compare the 2. I think Julian has been, and I think he can agree with that. So that is my experience. I got to travel. I got to learn a lot of Portuguese. I got to learn about the Brazilian healthcare system, and I got to learn surgical skills too. And I honestly recognize a lot of familiarities between Brazil and Canada, similarities. Things are very, very similar, especially in rural parts of Canada. I think I've done a few practicums in rural towns, and things are similar in terms of access to resources. So that's my experience. I definitely recommend it if you are a med student. It was a great experience, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Maybe not in Portuguese, but
They have 2 languages to work with. Actually, 3. You speak other languages too, Kiara.
yeah.
Thank you, Kiara, for highlighting how different but similar medicine is in different areas of the world. Also, how important it is to be adaptable and culturally sensitive when being immersed in a different culture, and some of the realities that comes with it, especially if you don't know the language, if you don't know how everything works. And so we'll take some questions. I know Janet already has a question. If you have any questions you want to speak or put your cameras on, feel free to also do that. We'll start with the one in the chat. Were the skills you were allowed to practice skills that within the scope of practice in Canada for 3rd-year meds? Were you in the publicly funded system all the time? And I think this was probably for Kiara.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for those questions. So I haven't done my third year surgery rotation yet. So difficult to say if it's similar. I think for the most part, yes, we are allowed to do stitches. We are allowed to intubate. We do that in anesthesia, I believe. What else did I say that I did?
So what I'm getting at, sorry, is that did they teach you these things? Like, so you're coming out of second year
Correct.
and you're suturing and you're closing up and whatnot. Were these things that they spent time teaching you and then you had an incremental kind of clinical exposure? Because I know sometimes in the past, students were thrown into situations doing stuff that they weren't quite prepared for. So,
yeah, so they definitely so the way it worked was they showed me what they expected or what they wanted, and then I was very proactive in speaking up about what I felt comfortable doing and what I was not
really
comfortable
up to
with.
you to define the limit. Okay.
Yes, because it was very different between me and between the other international students, you know, from Poland, from Portugal. We were at different levels. So it was
Right.
important for us
Right.
to stay.
Okay.
They taught me how to hand suture or hand tie, which I didn't know how to do. So they taught me on a string on the side, and then later on I did it in surgery.
And were you always in the system, the publicly funded system, or
Yeah. Yeah. So
you didn't get to see the private at all?
No, there was one private surgery that did take place for some reason. I didn't understand why, but in our hospital,
Okay.
the
Probably
hospital
because the
had
doctor
both.
practices in both and he wasn't free or something.
Exactly, yeah. The hospital had both, but I don't know why it was happening on the public side. But it was interesting because so for the public, they use reusable gowns and reusable sterile material that they have procedures to sterilize. But for the private, they use disposable one-time use gowns
Mhm.
and so for that surgery, they used disposable things, but for the med student, they gave me the reusable one. So that was interesting, really, in terms of resource allocation.
Okay. So it'd be fun for you to gone to a private place.
Mhm.
So different and so ritzy
Yeah.
and yeah.
Yes, no, I didn't get to go.
Okay, thanks.
Does anyone else have anything to add to this question?
I think it's a really good opportunity to make the point. I think for mainly for our med students in the crowd is to know your limits and to think about that while you're practicing in a different place. I know that for myself, an example came up where we're at Majengo, a delivery is happening, and a second delivery starts happening right next door. And so the doctor looks at me and says, "Can you deliver this baby?" And it's like, obviously, I cannot deliver a baby in Canada. No one would want a second year medical student delivering their baby. And so the same rules apply no matter where you are. And I think it's really important to be able to say no in those situations when you're not comfortable or when it's not ethical as well either. Like maybe you could have figured out how to deliver the baby, but it certainly would not have been an ethical choice to make. And so again, on that reflection point, it's really important for med students to keep that into consideration when you're practicing abroad and when you're learning abroad.
I agree, and I've seen this over the last 45 years, and fortunately we're kind of getting better hold of this, but you know, in the past you guys had come back and somebody said, oh, I got to do a cholecystectomy, and I just die, you know, because we wouldn't want a second year med student operating on us or doing stuff. So we want to make sure, and the same with physicians when they go on projects, they should not be allowed to practice. Canadian physicians should not be allowed to practice or do anything in another country just because they do it in Canada. But somehow it still is very much, oh, you're from Canada, then please lay your hands on us. Some people will feel that way, and that's totally unacceptable. And it's something that we have to keep working at, but you guys are terrific. You've done a great job. It must have been hard. Well, you spoke Spanish. I mean, yeah, so that's like my Portuguese too. I kind of mix the all three and somehow you communicate, but that's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, somehow it works.
Yeah. No, that's really great. Wonderful.
Amazing. Does anyone else have any other questions or anything else? Yes, we have Ishika in the chat. I had a question for Aquino. Could you give an example or two of how Indigenous health practice is integrated in Tanzania? I know that is an area we could work on improving in Canada.
Yeah, I honestly don't have a great answer in terms of how it's actually integrated because I was working with malaria researchers and not healthcare providers. But what I did notice, but like from our conversations, is that traditional medicine is much more commonplace in Tanzania than it is here. So I was getting to hear about some of the plants that they use locally for certain cures for like common ailments and things. So that was really interesting to hear about. But in terms of like the actual healthcare system itself, I can't really answer that question for you.
Does anyone else have anything that they wanted to about
I had a question.
Indigenous health? Yeah.
I was just wondering for the other countries that you visited. I know that some of you mentioned you spoke different languages, but I was just wondering what would be like the best, or you found the best way to learn a new language? Like, was it Duolingo, you take classes, or anything specific that you found was the best way?
I think like there's different strategies. Everyone will use different things. There's Duolingo, there's different apps you can do. I think that in my experience in Tanzania, I wasn't super effective at learning Swahili. I wish that I had gotten better at it or taken courses beforehand. In my personal life in other places, when I lived in Mexico for a while on exchange, I found that that was a really good way to learn Spanish because I was immersed in it. I find that often immersion is one of the best ways to learn languages properly. But again, not always the easiest thing to do. So I think utilizing our 21st century technology, Duolingo, those kind of things. I know my brother who did many exchanges in his life. He uses like a Skype software to like Skype with people in certain countries and practice his languages that way. Either way, I think conversation is a really good way to do it.
Yeah, I think language is born of frustration, they say. So if you can get yourself in a situation where you have to speak it, then like the frustration of not being able to communicate really does help get those foundations there. I just wanted to say, I don't know if it's changed. When I started trying to learn Swahili with Duolingo, it had written Swahili, but it didn't have like any support for spoken or listening. I don't know if it does now, but the like with each language, with each country that you're interested in going to, look into communities that are dedicated to that language, because there are going to be ways that are better for certain languages, just in terms of what support there is and what methods work well for people.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yanni, do you have a question? Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you guys. It was really, really helpful. I think you guys all had really cool slides too, so it was nice to see pictures and everything. Aquino, I had a quick question for you. Because you're in the MPH and so am I. So I was just wondering, in terms of like timelines and stuff, when did you like start kind of looking into like going abroad and all that? Because I know we have like our practicum advisor, which is Anik, and she's kind of taking the lead on that. But in terms of, yeah, like maybe timelines and stuff, was there certain things you have to follow?
Yeah,
Yeah.
so this specific placement is one of the placements that came out on the internal list for MPH students. So I don't know if you've received that yet, but I think we received it around the holidays. So it was just one of the options on there that I could apply to internally. I think if you're going to try to find something external, it might be a bit different, but I would start looking, yeah, around the same time over the holidays for sure, in terms of applying for practicums.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Thanks, guys.
Thank you guys so much for your presentation today. And I hope everyone in the audience enjoyed it as much
Thanks,
as we did.
Julian and Charles and everybody else.
Thanks,
Charles,
everyone.
you're nearly there. You're nearly there.
Thanks for moderating, Lena. Appreciate it.
Thank
Awesome.
you.
Thank you.
Great job, guys. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care. Good night again.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.